To the outside world, Vladimir Putin projects confidence. He carries himself with an intimidating aura, always standing upright and more than willing to mock those who don't agree with his viewpoint. He's the strong man of Russian politics, the one man above all others whom Russians can rely upon to bring their country wealth, prosperity, and in the context of the Ukraine war, complete dominance over those who oppose Russia. But looks can be deceiving, and behind the veil that Putin erects lies a man who's terrified of everyone and everything around him. Putin's paranoia has exploded, leading to Russia's president living in constant fear of a Kremlin betrayal. None of this would be evident from the image that Putin presents to the world. However, the signs are there that Putin's paranoia is getting the best of him, and one only needs to look at a spate of recent deaths to see one of those signs. Back on July 8, news broke that Russia's former Transport Minister, Roman Starovoit, had committed suicide a day before. Starovoit's body was discovered in a park on the outskirts of Moscow with a gunshot wound to the head. A pistol lay beside his body, suggesting that Starovoit had turned the gun on himself, and he may well have had a motive. Starovoit had been fired from his role just a few hours before by Putin himself. The incident shocked Russia, but it shouldn't have. After all, for as dramatic as Starovoit's exit from the mortal plane may have been, it was far from the first time that a prominent Russian official had met an untimely death in recent memory. Just a few days earlier, the vice president of the Russian oil transportation company, Transneft, experienced a similar grisly fate. This time, it wasn't a gun that was a weapon of choice. Andrei Badalov had taken an unfortunate tumble from the window of an apartment building, Foreign Affairs noted back in September. And Badalov's death was also far from unique. As the same outlet notes, a shocking 56 of Russia's most prominent officials and business people have met their end since Putin invaded Ukraine, many of them in strange and some might say suspicious circumstances. These types of deaths have become so common that there's even a term that describes them: sudden Russian death syndrome. The Atlantic helped to popularize the term back in December 2022. At that point, the number of strange deaths that had occurred among Russia's elite was in the 20s, with notable deaths including yet more window falls, supposed suicides, and even suspicious heart attacks suffered by people who appear to have clean bills of health. Sudden Russian death syndrome can be applied to any death of a prominent Russian official that seems to be out of place or improperly explained. And if the hints so far haven't made it clear, there's a very high probability that these deaths were intentionally caused by the Kremlin and perhaps ordered by Putin himself. Take, for example, the repeated falling from windows. It's plausible to believe that one fall could be an accident, maybe even two. But defenestration has become common enough now that it's almost a running joke that those who anger Putin are experiencing unfortunate trips out of high windows. Defenestration has been a favorite method of removing political opponents since the early days of multi-story buildings, but in the modern era, Russia has monopolized the practice. Like Tosca's climatic exit from the battlements of Castel San Angelo, death by falling from a great height has a performative, even moral aspect. Elaine Godfrey wrote in The Atlantic in December 2022. It appears that Putin has a performative streak. What he doesn't realize is that these deaths are revealing the cracks in his performance as Russia's strongman. Sudden Russian death syndrome has become rife since Russia invaded Ukraine because Putin is paranoid. Opposition, even from friendly faces who might only want the best for Putin and Russia, has become the enemy. And even those whom Putin appears to outwardly trust are now at risk. Often what Putin is doing is kept under wraps. Sudden Russian deaths are so mysterious because they come without warning and sometimes happen in tragically comical ways. However, Russia's president is sometimes more forthright in his desire to purge the people whom he deems a threat. Foreign Affairs offers the example of the Kremlin's crackdown on Russia's Ministry of Defense in 2024. That crackdown led to the sacking of Sergei Shoigu, who was demoted to the largely irrelevant position of chair of Russia's Security Council. Shoigu was lucky. He got a demotion, while others who served under him received much worse. Shoigu's deputy, Timur Ivanov, was slapped with a 13-year prison sentence for supposed corruption. That sentence ranks as one of the largest ever handed out to a Russian official. Many arrests have taken place since. Along with the sudden deaths of prominent figures, a strange trend seems to be emerging that the closer somebody gets to Putin, the more likely they're to be in danger. Could this be Putin keeping his friends close and his enemies closer? Or has Putin's paranoia engulfed him to the point where anybody who enters his orbit has become a threat? Russia may be trying to create the narrative that all of these incidents are related to Putin purging the corrupt from his circle. It's not about paranoia. The Kremlin wants people to believe Putin is just creating a purer form of Russian government. However, that seems rich, given that Russia is a society that runs on corruption and Putin is often at the heart of it. As far back as January 2016, the BBC was reporting that the US Treasury believed Putin to be corrupt himself. Adam Zubin, who at the time oversaw American sanctions against Russia, made the accusation crystal clear. We've seen him enriching his friends, his close allies, and marginalizing those he doesn't view as friends using state assets. Whether that's Russia's energy wealth, whether it's other state contracts, he directs those to whom he believes will serve him and excludes those who don't. To me, that's a picture of corruption, Zubin said. He seems to have a point. Putin has a massive net worth that the Week says could be as high as $200 billion. That's pretty strange given that the official Kremlin documents suggest that Putin earns a $140,000 salary from his role as Russia's president. It almost suggests that the people who Putin is purging, be it through demotions, jail sentences, or sudden Russian death syndrome, are the very people who have enriched Putin throughout his tenure as Russia's president. Fighting corruption isn't the real goal for Putin. He is corrupt. No, the real goal in everything that Putin is doing right now is to avoid what he views as the ever-growing spectre of internal threats that could strip him of the power to which he so desperately clings. What Putin is doing to these people, who were once part of his inner circle or responsible for enriching him, is intended to create a climate of fear that leaves everyone around Putin as paranoid as Putin himself has become. Foreign Affairs discusses this, noting that even the most experienced members of Russia's political class found Starovoit's death particularly difficult. On the one hand, he had not been yet charged with anything, but on the other, it was clear that he had chosen death over prison, the outlet says. Several members of Russia's government also attended Starovoit's funeral, which only adds to the uncertainty. By attending, are those officials putting themselves at risk by grieving somebody whom Putin had identified as a threat? Or is all of this a real tragedy that Putin never intended to happen, making it okay to attend the funeral? These are questions likely going through the minds of many Russian officials in the wake of Starovoit's death, and they're the questions that Putin wants his officials to be pondering. He made his own position on the funeral ambiguous too. Russian state media had reported that Putin was going to send a wreath to the funeral, indicating that it was okay for others to attend. However, those reports were later retracted, despite running on state news agencies over which Putin has influence. A test perhaps, a twisted way for Putin to identify who else is a risk to his position. It's difficult to tell, at least in Starovoit's case, there seemed to be some link to the corruption that Putin wants to cleanse. Several of the dead minister's colleagues had been implicated in embezzlement schemes, one of which siphoned $250 million away from a project designed to strengthen Russia's border with Ukraine. That sort of thing was standard practice in Russia before the Ukraine war. Now, when Putin is trying to scrape together every bit of cash that he can to keep the war going, such actions could be a death sentence. This may be another mark of Putin's paranoia. He may be so obsessed with the Ukraine war that his tunnel vision has led him to believe that any action that harms the war effort is intended to be malicious toward Putin. That alone is enough to create fear among Russia's elite. And fear is certainly what Starovoit felt. The BBC spoke to Nina Khrushcheva, who's a professor of international affairs at New York's The New School. He must have feared that he would receive tens of years in prison if he was going to be under investigation, and that his family would suffer tremendously, Khrushcheva said of Starovoit. So there's no way out. I immediately thought of Sergei Shoigu, one of Stalin's ministers, who killed himself in 1937 because he felt there was no way out. When you start thinking of 1937 in today's environment, that gives you great pause. Keep that link to Stalin in mind. It'll be revisited later in the video. Of course, the counter-argument to Putin allowing his paranoia to lead him to create this environment of fear is that it all seems so counterproductive. If Putin is purging anybody he considers to be a possible threat, it also means he's losing people who could provide valuable advice or even enrich Russia's leader through the very corruption he claims to be tackling. However, Putin warned Russia's elite that this was coming, even if many didn't believe him. In March 2022, NPR reported that Putin had rattled off a warning to every anti-war Russian. The Russian people will always be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors and simply spit them out like a gnat that accidentally flew into their mouths, Putin declared while railing against Russians who he said were mentally aligned with the West. I'm convinced that such a natural and necessary cleansing of society will only strengthen our country, our solidarity, cohesion and readiness to respond to any challenges, Putin added. This should have been a sign, as the elite who thought Putin would never come for them likely clapped along to these statements. Putin was outright telling everybody that anybody who opposed him would be cleansed. What many in Russia didn't seem to realize at the time, that Putin's identity had already become so wrapped up in his desire to claim Ukraine for Russia that anything that could even slightly harm that goal puts a person in the category of those who need to be cleansed. The officials who embezzled $250 million from a border project are the perfect example. An action that would have, in the past, seen Putin come calling for his slice of the pie instead led to arrest and jail time for the perpetrators. That, in a nutshell, is the transformation. The Russia that Putin created and oversaw for more than 2 decades has been utterly changed by Putin's obsession with Ukraine and the paranoia that's been largely born from it. Still, many in Russia believe that the many examples of what's happening to those that Putin views as opponents won't ever concern them. People know they need to behave cautiously, but their conformist behavior is shaped more by learned indifference and anticipatory obedience to everything they cannot influence, Foreign Affairs says. Russia's elite face a different problem. Engulfed in the fear that paranoid Putin has created, they're stuck trying to be subservient while standing on ground that constantly shifts beneath their feet. So, how could one of Russia's elite even know that Putin is coming for them? Salami. Putin employs what are known in Russia as salami tactics to slowly work his way toward the people he wants to rid himself of. This strategy can be seen in action on a far broader scale in how Russia is currently testing NATO and the collective West with drone and fighter jet incursions. The idea is to take a series of gradual steps, i.e. slicing the salami, to achieve a goal without any one of those steps alerting the intended target of the pressure to what's eventually going to happen. Russia's approach to NATO is designed to avoid provoking a major counter-response. If one comes, Putin can then argue that Russia didn't do anything big enough to encourage it. In the context of how Putin is treating so many of Russia's elite, the salami tactic is employed slightly differently. Putin starts by going for the subordinates and the minor officials who work under the command of his real target. The layers are sliced off, removing the foundation that props up the target before Putin goes in for the kill. That's what happened with Starovoit and Shoigu. The slicing of the salami seems to be accelerating in Russia right now, but Putin is still following the same routine. Presumably, those he targets can see this coming, assuming that they're familiar with the tactic. However, there's nothing they can do about it, other than submit to being arrested or allowing themselves to experience a case of sudden Russian death syndrome, in whatever form that may take, when Putin is ready to make the last slice. Right now, Putin's targets seem to be Russia's technocrats and oligarchs, and it's here where Russia's leader, being so terrified of betrayal, could end up destroying his own country. Putin is replacing much of Russia's elite with military heroes who have served in Ukraine. The Ukraine war tunnel vision is strong here, as Putin's paranoia has led him to believe that only those who have distinguished themselves in Ukraine are capable of serving his vision for Russia. As for Russia's technocrats, Putin is keeping the ones he needs, such as those who are ensuring Russia maintains some semblance of economic stability despite Putin's massive spending on Ukraine, and getting rid of those he doesn't need. Russia's tech industry, in particular, is suffering from this approach. As the Moscow Times reported in June, Putin has turned against Russia's tech innovators. The Western companies that were working in Russia and supporting some of the country's brightest minds have all been pushed out, even though Putin was courting those very companies just a few short years ago. The objective, as in all things that Putin does now, is control. Allowing Russians to innovate and potentially make more of themselves is the very antithesis of this control. This is another type of purge, one that isn't about eradicating the people in Putin's circle that he no longer trusts, but rather about ensuring that nobody can rise up unexpectedly from beneath him to become a challenger to his throne. This refusal to allow anybody to rise too high manifests in Putin's seeming inability to choose a successor for the empire that he's built. He apparently has a list, the Kyiv Independent reported in May, but the 73-year-old Putin doesn't appear to be grooming anybody to take over when he's gone. It's easy for the Kremlin to choreograph a splendid inauguration, Chatham House said when questioning what the next 6 years of Putin's rule would look like in May 2024. But it's quite another matter to deal with the fallout of the war, the succession of a president determined to crush opposition, and the many other tasks that need to be tackled during the coming presidential term. Putin will leave a vacuum behind if he dies without being betrayed first, and his paranoia that everybody around him is out to get him means he sees no solution other than to leave this vacuum behind, which will only create more problems for Russia as it tries to deal with the aftermath of the Ukraine war. However, perhaps the greatest examples of Putin's paranoia come from the man's strange habits. On October 22, Times Radio published an interview with Joe Parkinson, who's the chief of the World Enterprise team at the Wall Street Journal. The interviewer brings up such strange habits as Putin building identical conference rooms, all with the exact same number of sharpened pencils. Again, it's control in action. Everything must be how Putin wants it to be, or his paranoid mind will tell him that somebody somewhere is out to get him. Putin's past plays a part in all of this, said Parkinson to Times Radio.
He still views the world very much through an intelligence lens and a lens of paranoia, and we all saw aspects of that, particularly during COVID with the long table and the isolation and people questioning at that point before the invasion actually just how whether he was still completely kind of compos mentis.
Parkinson's point appears to be that what's seen today in Putin is the result of a long descent into isolation that's been happening for years. Putin has become so distrustful of everybody around him, Parkinson adds, that he doesn't even want his top officials to know precisely where he is. Putin apparently doesn't spend as much time at his office in the Kremlin as he once did, as he now prefers to spend time in one of his many presidential palaces. It's here where the identical rooms come into play, Parkinson told Times Radio.
According to the American intelligence agency and others that we spoke to, he's built these identical rooms so that when he's photographed, he could, in theory, be in any one of these palaces.
Putin will also order decoy planes to be flown when he plans a journey, all to create confusion and minimize the chances of somebody coming to get him. If that isn't paranoia, what is? Earlier in the video, Stalin was referenced. This reference reveals a great irony in Putin's behavior. Foreign Affairs brings up the 1920s, when Stalin was first coming to power. At the time, one of Stalin's closest allies was a man named Nikolai Bukharin. As Stalin became ever more deeply entrenched in power, even Bukharin found himself a target. Stalin had one of his closest allies arrested for conspiracy in 1937 and had him executed a year later. That was all part of Stalin doing his utmost to purge and replace everybody who had played a role in bringing him to power. Stalin was 73 when he died. By the end, even his own doctors were scared of touching him as they faced his paranoid wrath. Putin is the same age as Stalin was when he died, and he seems to be playing from the Stalin playbook with his actions today. Perhaps he sees Stalin's rule, which lasted from 1924 until he died in 1953, as an inspiration. Putin clearly has a taste for history, as he's used any number of weaponized historical excuses to justify his war in Ukraine. But the great irony is that Stalin's obsession with maintaining control and his intense paranoia led him to overseeing a country filled with repression and crippled by a terrible economy that harmed its people and ultimately created so much fear that he couldn't even trust anybody to help him as he lay dying. Putin is walking down the same path, and it may end up being the path that leads him to the betrayal that he's so desperately trying to avoid. The Stalinist repression already exists. Russia's economy is struggling, though not yet outright tanked. Perhaps all that Putin can now hope for is to die while in power rather than be replaced by somebody that even his paranoid mind never saw coming. After all, despite his best efforts, Putin is losing control of Russia. Soviet collapse 2.0 is on the horizon, and you can learn all about it by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Putin's loosening grasp on sanity and control.